webinar today about starting a Healthy School Meals for All campaign. As Nomi said, my name is Alexis Bylander, and I'm a Senior Child Nutrition Policy Analyst at FRAC. And this is one of my favorite topics to talk about, and so I'm excited for all the content that we're going to go through today. Next. So our roadmap for today's webinar is that we'll be covering the benefits of Healthy School Meals for All, the landscape of current campaigns across the country, and then walk through the main components of building a successful statewide campaign. We'll save the last 10 minutes of this webinar to go through any Q&A that people might have. And throughout the webinar, if you have questions that you want to ask, feel free to put them in the Q&A box, and the speakers that aren't currently presenting will answer those questions along the way if they're able. Next slide. So the speakers on today's webinar include myself from FRAC. We also have Anna Corson from Full Plates, Full Potential in Maine, and Faye Mack from Hunger Free Vermont. Next slide. So when we talk about Healthy School Meals for All, we're really talking about the bold goal that every school that uses the school nutrition programs would serve breakfast and lunch to all students at no cost to families. Next slide. And the benefits of doing this are clear. Healthy School Meals for All would ensure that all students, regardless of their household income, would be hunger-free and ready to learn. It would eliminate the stigma that can sometimes be associated with the school meal program. It would end unpaid school meal debt that is currently a problem for many families and schools. And it would ease administrative burdens for school staff. Next. And perhaps most importantly, it would help to advance equity. Providing school meals to all students is critical for advancing racial equity and justice, as it would ensure that Black, Indigenous, and Latinx students are able to access the key nutrition they need to thrive in the classroom and beyond. Next. So in terms of materials that we have to support all of the benefits of Healthy School Meals for All, we currently have 2 pieces on our website, and Nomi is going to put the links to those resources in the chat now. The first is a 5-page research brief called The Case for Healthy School Meals for All that lays out all of the evidence and rationale for why providing free meals to all students at all schools would be a good idea. And then on the next slide, you'll see that we have a shorter piece that is a blog post about the top 10 reasons to support free Healthy School Meals for All. This was written by Dr. Janet Poppendick, who is a professor and also the author of Free for All, Fixing School Food in America, and outlines some of the top line arguments for Healthy School Meals for All. Next slide. So when we think about school meals, we know that the pandemic has really changed the landscape. COVID-19 has highlighted the critical role that school meals play for children. And since the pandemic started, all schools have had the option to provide free school meals to all students through waivers from USDA. Next. And a recent survey from the School Nutrition Association found that school meal program directors across the country reported that serving free meals to all students during the pandemic increased access, improved equity, and fueled a large decrease in unpaid meal debt. Next. And there is a lot of momentum building for the idea of keeping free school meals for all a permanent part of the school day. Students, parents, school staff, administrators, and other stakeholders see the benefits of free school meals for all and do not want to go back to a tiered payment system. Next slide. Over the last couple of years, we've also seen a steady stream of supportive earned media. We've seen headlines in the Washington Post, like this opinion piece, free school meal programs don't just feed hungry kids, they're a major win for moms. There was an opinion piece in The Hill, school meals should remain free for all children today and always. And other headlines like our shot at creating hunger-free schools, and experts argue in support of a state bill that would provide free school lunches. And this is just a small sampling of the pieces that we've seen in newspapers throughout the country in support of this concept of free school meals for all. Next slide. At a national level, FRAC is just one of many national organizations that are supportive and are active advocates for healthy school meals for all. The logos on the slide represent just a few of our national partners, which include the School Nutrition Association, the Urban School Food Alliance, the National Education Association, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, Moms Rising, AFT, and the Children's Defense Fund. And as you can see from this sampling, they really represent lots of different types of organizations that are all united that this would be a win for students and families. Next slide. So there are three likely pathways to achieving healthy school meals for all. The first is federal legislation, which means that we would pass a federal law that would establish this for all states. The other path would be incremental steps at the state or federal level. An example of this could be if you're familiar with the community eligibility provision that currently exists. We could be expanding that so that more schools would have the opportunity to serve free meals to all students. And then the third pathway is state legislation, and that's what this webinar today is focused on. So we'll look at that more. Next slide. Currently, two states, California and Maine, have passed school meals for all legislation, and that has happened somewhat recently. Next slide. But when we look at this map of the country, you can see that there's wins in California and Maine, and that there are a handful of other states that have active campaigns working on healthy school meals for all. And those include Vermont, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Maryland, Wisconsin, and New York. And several other states are contemplating, advocates in many other states are contemplating campaigns as well. Next slide. So now we wanted to look at what it takes, the building blocks of a successful Healthy School Meals for All campaign. And we're going to learn today from our speakers in Maine and Vermont. And we're lucky to have Anna with Full Plate Full Potential in Maine talking about their successfully passed legislation. And then we're also lucky to have Faye Mack from Vermont, where they are in the thick of their multi-year advocacy campaign to achieve Healthy School Meals for All. And they have so much great information, both of them, and lots of learnings from both campaigns. So let's get started, and I'm hoping that this next part of the webinar will act almost as though we were in a panel in person. So with the next slide, the first component that we wanted to cover was just starting a campaign. If you're in a state right now that is, and you're thinking that this would benefit your state and you want to know how to get started or how to know if now is the right time for you to take on this issue, I wanted to go to Faye first to ask, in Vermont, what was the point where your organization decided that the time was right for a universal school meals campaign? So Faye, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Alexis. Hi, everyone. And I'll just say before I start that in Vermont, we call our campaign the Universal School Meals Campaign. I try my best to talk about healthy food, healthy school meals for all, but I am back and forth. So it's the same thing as I continue on. But we've been working on our Universal School Meals campaign for a number of years, actually, and we consider, there was a big inflection point when legislation was first introduced, and there was a whole previous section of the campaign to sort of build to legislation. But at Hunger Free Vermont, we had been working for years in an incremental way to build toward the inevitable launch of a bill to actually bring us fully to the finish line where all schools in Vermont are mandated to serve universal school meals. And it started way back, over a decade ago in focusing on eliminating the reduced price category for school meals. And then when universal school meals became an option for more schools through the community eligibility provision launch, we sort of switched our focus to technical assistance and trying to build as many schools as possible to utilize community eligibility and to serve universal school meals. But what we did throughout that time was continuously talk to our state legislature, give them reports on what was going on with school meals, and in all of those interactions, we said, we will hit a ceiling. These federal options can only take us so far. And eventually we're going to come to you with a bill to help us go all of the way. So we spent a number of years really building an expectation to the point where in 2019, we started hearing from legislators essentially saying, hey, where's that bill that you keep talking about? Is it time for the bill? And so in 2020, we worked with legislators to introduce legislation. And that was our key moment because we had sort of hit the ceiling with community eligibility. We had about 25% of schools in Vermont using that or provision 2 to provide universal school meals, and there weren't really any left where it was financially viable for them to do it on their own without additional funding. And so we worked with legislators to launch a campaign. Now, of course, January 2020 proved to be a very odd time to start a legislative campaign. Vermont's legislative session runs from January through May every year. So we had just started to get going when the pandemic put everything on hold and the legislature sort of ditched any kind of bill they were working on and switched their focus to COVID relief. So we relaunched a new bill this last year in 2021, and it's all part of the same campaign. But right now we're working off of a piece of legislation that was introduced in the beginning of 2021. And so it's a little bit about our timeline, but really we spent a lot of time building. And I was thinking about this and sharing this with you all and thinking that in some ways that experience isn't very relevant anymore, I don't think. When we first had a bill introduced in early 2020, it was the first piece of state legislation for universal school meals in the country. Not that many people knew what universal school meals was. There was no real national momentum. Senator Bernie Sanders had introduced a bill in Congress in late 2019. So there wasn't really a national conversation about this. That was just sort of in the ether the way it is now. But the whole, as Alexis was saying, there's been a huge shift in narrative and momentum. And so if you're considering a statewide campaign, I don't think you need all those years of building anymore. You can just jump right in, which is really exciting. So the time is now for all of you.
Yeah, yeah, Faye, I'm glad that you framed it that way, both talking about how your campaign started, but also acknowledging that we're in a completely different space now, and there's an opportunity for everyone who wants to start a campaign now. All right, let's go to the next slide. And the next part of building a campaign that we wanted to cover is building a coalition. And really, when I think about this issue and when I look at the existing campaigns across the country, I see just a plethora of potential partners. So I think when we're talking about free school meals for all, there are lots of obvious groups that may want to be involved in this, and they would include anti-hunger advocates, food banks, schools, state nutrition associations, PTAs, religious organizations, health systems, labor unions, foundations, and more. And if we go to the next slide, I wanted to show you this graphic from the California School Meals for All Coalition website where, okay, of course, these icons are all too small for you to actually be able to read who those groups are, but I've included the URL off to the side, School Meals for All, where you can see the hundreds of groups that were involved in California's campaign. And then I want to turn it over and go to the next slide for Anna to talk about how coalition building worked in Maine.
Yeah, thanks so much, Alexis. And hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here today and great to be here with Faye. So I would say that a strong and broad coalition is absolutely a critical piece to a successful School Meals for All campaign. Just being able to demonstrate that School Meals for All kids is important to stakeholders in all different sectors. So, as Alexis just shared, having folks who represent anti-hunger organizations, educational organizations, public health, healthcare, it just really demonstrates that this touches all parts of our world, and that children's health and well-being is so important and completely tied to them accessing good food at school. So as Faye just said, there's not a lot of building needed right now. There is so much momentum, but I would say start building your campaign, your coalition for your campaign as early as possible. So start right now if you're considering starting a School Meals for All campaign. I'm sure people will just be jumping on board because there is so much momentum. Here in Maine, we similar to Vermont, we started conversations about school meals for all years ago, and we really started building our coalition a long time ago as a part of addressing food access in schools. So we were really starting a conversation about kids not having access to food at schools. We had a lot of coalition partners at the table when we started to talk about breakfast, that kids weren't accessing breakfast. And we worked together to mandate a breakfast after the bell law in Maine. In high needs communities, we also worked on a mandate that all high needs communities provide summer meals and after school meals. And we eliminated the reduced price copay for school meals for both breakfast and lunch. And through all of those conversations, we included our partners from lots of different organizations, backgrounds, and sectors. So we had the Maine School Nutrition Association. So I would, make sure that you have your School Nutrition Association on board. We worked with state agencies like our Department of Education and Department of Health and Human Services. We, of course, had our anti-hunger advocate partners at the table. We worked with our Maine Education Association and the Principals Association and the Public Health Association. We got students on board. So really having a lot of people amplifying this message was so important. And when we were talking about breakfast and summer meals and after school meals, we would also bring school meals for all into the conversation and just kept amplifying that message and repeating it and making sure that it was something that legislators really had on their radar, so that when the day came that we would eventually bring a school meals for all bill to them, it wouldn't be a big surprise. And when we started to think about introducing a school meals for all bill, we started to really get more and more new partners to the table, and some organizations that were a little bit outside of our normal coalition partners. So, we had some organizations that were working on school safety and social emotional learning and student mental health. Our coalition has continued to grow. As Alexis shared, we did successfully pass a school meals for all law, but we are still working to get it fully funded. And so we're still welcoming new partners to the table. So most recently, we've had the Maine Council of Churches join us, the Maine chapter of American Academy of Pediatrics, and the American Heart Association. And, it seems like as the momentum grows, more organizations want to jump on board. We also made sure to join other people's meetings and conferences, and we were invited to speak about school meals for all at lots of different conferences and people's regional meetings, network meetings, and really that helped to continue to get the message out and to continue to grow our coalition. And once our campaign was really off and running, we created a shared and living document so that all of our coalition partners and anyone who wanted to get involved could have some great talking points with lots of data to back up those talking points to help in their conversations as they talked about school meals for all.
Excellent, Anna, thank you. And I wanted to share with everyone that since Faye and Anna started talking, I put in the chat links to both of their campaign websites. So you can save those links and go check out all of the material gathering and information gathering that they've already put into their campaigns and see what they had. And also along the lines of talking points, FRAC has a talking points document for healthy school meals for all as well. We don't keep it on our website because it's not that type of external facing document, but I will put my name and email address in the chat, and I'm happy to share that with anybody if it would be helpful. So Nomi, if we can go to the next slide. I'm sure that everyone on this call, or most of the people on this call, have been a part of various different coalitions of sizes and shapes and varying levels of effectiveness. And I think one of the very smart things that Vermont did at the beginning of putting their coalition together was to come up with some coalition principles about how they were going to work together and what type of legislation they were seeking to pass. So Faye, if I can turn it over to you and you can share with the group how that came together.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have sort of a couple of different levels of coalition, and tend to at Hunger for Vermont do everything in coalition. We have a joke really that we don't ever do anything alone, and no staff member ever does anything alone. So we knew we wanted to work with partners and have a coalition, and we ended up forming sort of a core coalition. We don't really use the term coalition. It's not formalized in that way, but we have a sort of a core group that's our strategy group. And that group, I'll just share who it's made up of, because I think that that's helpful. A lot of the different groups that Alexis mentioned. So we have ourselves as the anti-hunger advocacy organization. We have an organization called Vermont Feed, which leads farm to school and early childhood work throughout the state. So we've always had a very, very close connection to the farm to school world in all of our school meal related advocacy work. We also have our School Nutrition Association of Vermont chapter has been a key part of this. The largest teachers union in the state that also represents school nutrition professionals and other staff. A couple of folks who are either superintendents, business office managers from schools, but different people who weren't really representing their whole field, but were there as with their own expertise. And a couple of businesses who really were behind this as part of their social mission work. And then later on in our work, we've really brought in a group called Rights and Democracy, which is a grassroots organization. And so this core group came together to develop all of our beginnings. Our principles, as Alexis mentioned, also to develop the legislation with legislative leaders and talking points and messaging documents and all of those kinds of things. This is the group that kind of did that. Then we also, I'll mention before I talk about our principles a little bit more, we have a broader coalition. We have over 100 different businesses and organizations who've signed on as organizational supporters. And then we have individual supporters as well. But the organizational supporters, it's sort of similar to that beautiful graphic of all the logos from California, very broad and deep at the same time of folks who've signed on. They aren't necessarily part of decision making, but they're vocal and public supporters and will do things like share things on social media when we ask them to. But we still have this core strategy group. And what we'd spent a lot of time on in the beginning was develop campaign principles. And these principles help build alignment within a group. They help create a source of accountability. And they're essentially our bottom lines. And I'll read off a couple of them just to give you a sense of the flavor of them. But they're sort of like the bottom line. This is what we want. And the benefit of them is that when we're in the thick of it in the legislative session and I'm lobbying and I'm testifying in a committee and a committee member says, well, what if we did this to the bill? I have the principles in my head, and as long as they meet our principles, I can safely say, sure, let's explore that, or no, that is a no-go. The advocates will not support it. I can sort of say yes or no on behalf of the group without having to go back to the whole group because we have these bottom lines. And so just to share a little bit of some of what they are, our first principle is really our goal, that we will work together to make 2 meals available to every Vermont public school student on every school day with no direct charge to any student to get the meals. That's basically saying we want free school meals for all. But then we have some like our campaign and the solution to get to universal school meals must be respectful, equitable, and systemic. So that, and then there's some others underneath there. We believe that the state revenue source for universal school meals should not be regressive and will not require a cut to other important programs. We believe that school food service professionals should be recognized and engaged as major contributors to the integration of universal school meals into the educational day. So it's these kinds of principles, almost like values, that are our bottom lines. And anything that we support has to meet those principles. And I can share just a little bit about how they've been used. So we developed these, I think in 2018, a while ago, and used them to help develop the first piece of legislation. And then the pandemic hit and everything, was changed. And so when we came back to get ready for the 2021 legislative session, we brought everyone together to say, we need to make sure these principles still work. The whole world has changed. The landscape of school meals has changed. And we checked them, and with everyone, we intended to spend a couple of days kind of working through them, but everyone said, no, these still work. So we've used them, and they've helped with things like we've had legislators suggest, the state of Vermont already pays for school meals for reduced price students up to 185% of the poverty line. Why don't we just bump it up to 300%, which is similar to what has happened in Oregon. And that doesn't meet our campaign principles. So we're able to say, there are a lot of reasons why that's not the path that we wanted to take, but using the campaign principles, we've been able to respond to the moment and say that the advocacy community would not support that change. And it allows us to sort of push back. And the other thing it does, and I've been part of campaigns that didn't have principles, and I've seen this happen, is that when push comes to shove and you're at the end of the session and you're trying to make a deal with legislators, having these accountability measures keeps your coalition from splintering into two different groups, and having some people say like, okay, we're going to support this major compromise just to get something passed. And by having these principles to come back to, it gives people a sense of foundation from which to work, that it keeps splintering from happening, which has been very, very helpful.
That was great, Faye. Thank you so much. All right, let's go to the next slide, Nomi. So the next area of work is really writing the legislative language. And Faye, you've alluded to this a little bit, but Anna, let's go to you and talk about how you identified legislative champions and just started writing the bill language.
Yeah, so we kind of started at the top. So we first approached the Maine Senate president and the Maine Speaker of the House with this idea of introducing a school meals for all bill, and they both agreed to sponsor the bill. So the Senate president was the lead sponsor and the speaker was the lead co-sponsor. So that was a great place for our bill to live. They were just such champions throughout the session. They were able to really activate their legislative bodies to support this for the most part. And we were able to work really closely with both offices throughout the campaign on strategy and earned media. They were able to inform us when there may be some conversations that needed to happen with key legislators, where we could really activate some grassroots outreach to key legislators and address any concerns that were coming up. And we also made sure that we were working closely with the chairs of the Legislative Appropriations and Financial Affairs Committee throughout the entire session, since they hold the purse strings, and we knew that the money piece was going to be really challenging, and we're still working on that piece. But it was a similar relationship with those co-chairs, that we were just keeping them up to speed on the bill's progress, and they were able to advise us as to any concerns, potential challenges, any legislators that we should be engaging with who were on that committee specifically. We also talked to a lot of legislators across the board, across the aisle, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. But we made sure that we were introducing this concept first, and then introducing this piece of policy as the session went on to all the legislators that were in leadership here in Maine. And then as far as writing the bill language, so we were the lead organization on this effort, and so we were really able to take the lead on drafting the bill. And we modeled it after the bill that eliminated the reduced price copay that we had worked on years ago. So it was pretty basic language. We were able to work closely with the Senate President's office and the Legislative Revisor's office once the draft bill had been submitted. And we were lucky to be able to see the bill before it was sent to the committee for public hearing. The Revisor's office had over 2,000 bills come through last year, and they were, unfortunately, when they sent the draft back to us, what they had drafted had the state covering the cost of free school meals that the federal government already covers, and not covering the paid school meals. So it was basically the opposite of what we were striving for. So we were really glad that we got to see the bill and we could flag that. The Senate President's office was very busy, and so they missed that when the bill draft came out. So we were really glad that we were able to see the bill and we could really quickly make the edits needed. So one part of the bill that I wish had stronger language was the section that said that the Maine Department of Education and Maine schools would have to work to maximize federal funding through special provisions like the community eligibility provision, which provides free school meals to all kids in high needs districts. So the language that is included in our bill is not very strong there. It doesn't mandate it. It just says that they should continue to maximize federal funding. And then the draft bill did not include a fiscal note initially. That came later. But of course, the cost of school meals for all was a question that came up in many conversations, almost all conversations that we were having. So we never started a conversation with the cost of the bill. We really focused more on getting people on board with the policy and with why it was important. When people asked, we were prepared with a cost estimate that we could share, but it wasn't something that we wanted to bring up first. It was really about, this is important. This will make a big impact on kids, on schools, on Maine's future. So we really wanted to get people just on board with the concept first.
Great, thanks, Anna. And I wish I would have pulled the links for your legislation ahead of this webinar, but I think I just found the link for Maine, and I'm going to put it in the chat. And Anna, if you just want to double check that, and if that's not correct, replace it, that would be great. But Nomi will go to the next slide.
Alexis, can I add something quickly?
Yep.
So I just wanted to share just really briefly, just to highlight, like, this will look different. I know I saw somebody was asking about model legislation in the chat, and just wanted to share how differently things look in different states. So in Vermont, we can't pass a bill without funding. So there's no way for us to just pass universal school meals without the funding attached to it, which is why it's taking us a few more years. So there are all sorts of different intricacies in your own state that will also help guide the language. But ours, and I'll find our language and share it too, does have language that requires schools to maximize federal funding by, with a couple of specific things. It requires them to stay within the federal nutrition programs, to use CEP or Provision 2, and then to do things like breakfast after the bell or other measures to increase participation. So there's lots of different language you can pull from to get to that model language.
That's a great point. And it's looking like the link that I put in there didn't cut and paste properly. So this is a better idea. In our follow-up email after this webinar, I'll include links to the state legislation that has been introduced so far. And Anna, I think I'll turn it back to you for just one more question that we've got in the chat, and then we'll move on. But Catherine is wondering, how did Maine develop the cost estimate?
Yeah, that's a great question. We worked with our national partners at No Kid Hungry to come up with sort of a range of what this could potentially cost the state based on, so this was all happening in the midst of the pandemic. So school meals were just completely different than they had been pre-pandemic, as we all know. Participation rates had changed. And so we looked at, pre-pandemic participation rates. The Department of Education wanted us to include the participation rates that were happening during the pandemic, which, meals were free for all students. So it gave an idea of what that could potentially look like. And then we also had included pieces on if the federal government makes changes through Build Back Better, and there's, an expansion of federally funded free school meals, how that could impact Maine's cost estimate. So that's what we did. And then ultimately, it was up to the Department of Education to come up with what the fiscal note would be. And as Faye shared, it's really challenging to get a piece of legislation passed without any fiscal note attached to it. And in Maine, the fiscal note comes after the public hearing when they do a work session. And so there was a fiscal note, and later down the line, when it did pass, it passed with a small amount of funding attached to it. So it's not fully funded, it's partially funded, but there's a lot of ways to come up with a fiscal note, and I'd be curious to hear how that all went in Vermont as well. But especially right now, with participation rates being completely different than what they were pre-pandemic, with kids in school, out of school, remote learning, meals being delivered, it's it's hard to know what things will look like in the future. So that was an interesting process to be a part of. And I'll also be sure to share the link with you, Alexis, for the bill, so folks can look at the language.
Perfect, thanks. And Faye, let's go to you to talk about how Vermont developed the cost estimate before we move on, because that might be interesting to a lot of people participating.
Yeah, we have an amazing person named Tim on our staff who loves numbers, and he has dove deep. So we were able to get data from our Agency of Education about actual meals served and redemption and which categories for a number of years, and used that to basically model. So we had about 25% of schools prior to the pandemic already using universal school meals, mostly through CEP. And we used those participation rates to model what it would be like with all schools. And we're able to use the different free and reduced numbers and direct certification rates and all of that stuff. So we have a pretty detailed cost estimate that has led us to a range. And then that's our own cost estimate. Then what we do is the state has a nonpartisan joint fiscal office, and they develop the fiscal notes for all of the different pieces of legislation. So school meal funding is very complicated. And one of the things that has been really helpful is that we are the experts in the state about school meal funding. So we taught the Joint Fiscal Office folks about school meal funding, essentially. And we're able to really sit down and walk them through our estimate to help them come up with a range. And their range is a little bit different than ours. One of the things that we talk about a lot is our goal is to get them to a range of what is reasonably expected. So our Agency of Education put out a cost that basically was if no single student ever submits every school does provision 2, no single student ever submits a school meal application again. So they're all at the full paid rate. And if 100% of students participate every day. We know that's never, ever, ever going to happen. But that was the cost that they put in. So we're trying, what we want is the range of what's possible. And a range has proven to be a lot more helpful than a dollar amount, because you don't really know, right? Part of what we're talking about here is a huge social and cultural shift on how school meals are part of the education system and how kids eat in school. And so the full impact of a school going to universal school meals is different than the full impact of an entire state going to universal school meals. And a lot of the impact and then the cost isn't going to come for another 5 to 7 years, right? Because there's a lot of normalizing eating school meals at all income levels and things like that have to happen. So I do really recommend, if you can, to get down to a range. And then of course, the appropriation is going to have to be some kind of dollar amount, but a range is really helpful when talking with legislators.
I love your point about the range. I think that's really important. All right, well, Nomi, let's go to the next slide. And another part of building a campaign like this is really getting some media attention to the issue and what it means for individuals and communities and schools. And Maine did a really great job of getting some really positive media coverage. And I want to turn it back to Anna to talk about their inside strategy for making that happen.
Sure, thanks, Alexis. Just one final thought about fiscal notes, that what we ideally would have loved to see is sort of a, phased approach over a period of time, as Faye said, and I think it's such a great point, that this is a cultural shift. And so having, you know, a certain amount in the budget to start and then an increase over time based on projections that would be realistic for your state based on, you know, CEP participation in your state. That's what we were really hoping to see, but not what ended up happening. As Faye said, it, you know, usually ends up to be one dollar amount, but just a suggestion for other states that are thinking about this moving forward. So in Maine, we were very lucky to get a lot of media coverage over the course of our campaign. That involved a lot of my time ghostwriting op-eds and letters to the editor. So having a list of talking points with data at the ready was not only really helpful for our partners, but so helpful for me in ghostwriting lots and lots of op-eds. It was to the point that my son was concerned that my job was just to write letters for other people. So we thought of, you know, when we were thinking about who would have, you know, who would be great authors for op-eds, we had different sort of themes that we wanted to get across. One was about how School Meals for All advances equity in schools. For that one, we worked with the Maine Teacher of the Year, and then the former Undersecretary of the USDA, Kevin Concannon, who lives in Maine and is on our board. We also worked with our farm to school partners, and there was an op-ed that they authored about how School Meals for All really helps to get more local food in schools. And then we were fortunate to have a fiscal conservative Republican senator in our state write about why School Meals for All why that makes fiscal sense. And we also worked with with the editorial or opinion editors from the two big daily newspapers in Maine to set up editorial boards with them. And so we, over Zoom, talked through the policy, talked about why School Meals for All is so important, talked about food insecurity among kids in Maine, about, you know, the stigma associated with school meals, and just really got down to the nitty-gritties of why School Meals for All is so important and what that would mean for Maine kids. And so both papers ended up endorsing the School Meals for All policy. So that was really big to have those sort of endorsements by both of the big statewide papers, and to have it kind of broadcast on that level. So definitely recommend, if that's something that is possible in your state, to reach out to opinion editors and say, you know, we're working on this policy. This is why it's important, and we would love to spend some time talking to you more about this. So that was really helpful for us.
Great, thank you. All right, Nomi, next slide. So a huge component of a campaign is lobbying to actually make this happen and get it across the finish line. And Faye, you've talked about your work with legislators a little bit already in the conversation, but I'll just kind of leave this slide here as a space for you to talk about anything that you haven't had a chance to cover yet as it relates to lobbying.
Yeah, so Vermont's legislature, like a lot of states, is a citizen legislature, and legislators in Vermont don't have staff or an office. There's actually, when we're in person, which we haven't been since the start of the pandemic, there's no place that they can go where we can't follow them, and there's no one for them to say like, oh, contact, you know, this person instead of talking to me. So our relationships are really directly with legislators themselves, which is challenging at times and mostly really great. And because they're citizen legislatures, and really in general, one of the things we really try to lead with and remember when we're working with our legislators is that they are just people, and they are getting bombarded with things all over the place, and none of them are experts in what we are expert in. And so we really approach our work with legislators as thinking, how can we build champions? You know, how do we build up different legislators to be expert and to be champions of our cause, and to look to us as experts. So we often get called in. I just did this with our Senate Agriculture Committee yesterday to just give a general overview of like, what's happening with hunger and what's happening with SNAP and school meals in your state and in our state. And I just came in to give them a briefing, and that kind of relationship is really helpful to cultivate. And it's a lot easier to do if you remember that they're just a person. So that's one thing I would say. But we've been doing a lot of work to build champions. And so we celebrate the heck out of our legislators, and we let them really own, I mean, we don't let them, but we're excited when they really own the issue as their own issue, and when they own ideas that we've probably planted, but suddenly they're their ideas, and we are really excited by that and encourage that. And so we spend a lot of time trying to celebrate legislators, and that might mean, there are some legislators in Vermont who are active on Twitter. Twitter is like kind of not a thing in Vermont in general, but it is a little bit in the political world, and there are some legislators who do that. So we make sure that we tag them in things. We make sure to call out, thanking them on social media, and to offer opportunities for them to share their support in front of constituents. So, for example, the Vermont legislature is completely remote right now, and that changes the way that we can interact with them, and changes the way that we can interact with advocates or help community members and constituents who care about the cause to get involved. We can't really have like a day in the State House, which is what we would usually do with school nutrition professionals and students and teachers and parents and folks who really want universal school meals to happen. So earlier this week, or last week, we held a kickoff event, virtual one on Zoom, where we invited constituents to come, and I spoke and gave a overview of the policy. We had 2 different school nutrition directors, one of whom was the president of the School Nutrition Association, come and talk about what having universal school meals during the pandemic has meant to them. And we had one of our champion senators come, and we asked him to just come pep everybody up, and we gave him a platform from which to get people excited to say, what he wants to say that then could get shared out around his expectations and for the session and what needs to happen, and really tell people that to reach out to their legislators. And it's really helpful to give those kinds of platforms to folks who are champions. The other thing too, I would share that we do with legislators is just a lot of, we try to talk with everybody without lobbying. So lobbying itself is a term, that's a term that we use to talk about a lot of things, but actual lobbying is a very specific, narrow path. And there are a lot of conversations you can have that are not lobbying. And so we do a lot of just, hey, have you heard about the Universal School Meals Bill? Here's an overview of it. Do you have any questions about it? And then we might ask, do you support it? And if they say yes or no, yes, okay, great, we're so excited. No, is there any information that you might need that would help you think about this differently? But we don't try to convince them in that moment. There's a lot of meetings that we have where our goal is to not change their mind in that moment and have them say, yes, okay, I'm on board. Or to, but we try to just gather information, and then that helps us build out our communications, our calls to action, the way that we structure our testimony in committees. And so that's another piece of it. And then the final thing I would share is that one of the beauties of universal school meals, and Anna mentioned this a little bit earlier when she was talking about the coalition, is that there's kind of something in universal school meals for everyone, right? It's a public health issue. It's an education issue. It's a social justice and equity issue. It's a local food issue and a health and nutrition issue. I mean, you can come at universal school meals from caring about pretty much anything, and find a place for yourself in universal school meals. And we've taken that approach in how we talk with legislators and with committee members. So we could go into any committee. It's a workforce issue, right? We could go into any kind of committee and talk about it. And so we try to hear legislators and hear what they're interested in and show them that path and show them that connection. And that helps build, we have tripartisan support for universal school meals in Vermont, and multiple legislators from all different committees who've signed on in support and who care about it.
That's great, Faye. And I think it is so interesting to hear how state legislatures vary from state to state, how they're staffed, the processes that they use. But a lot of what you talked about in terms of building relationships and sharing information and celebrating successes, like really is applicable, to any state, regardless of how the legislature is set up. So, Nomi, let's go to the next slide.
This is my last slide, Alexis. Oh, there's one other one.
Okay, and I wanted Anna to talk a little bit about how Maine was able to build some bipartisan support for their successful legislation, and maybe we'll keep this part brief just so that we can wrap up with some closing thoughts and then see if there's any questions from the group. So Anna, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I'll zip through this part. So Maine is similar, it sounds like, to Vermont. Maybe it's a New England thing where our legislators are so approachable and, I had a former teacher and someone I nannied for as some of the legislators that we were speaking to. So they truly are people. And even if they're not as approachable in your state, they are still just people. I think that's such an important message that Faye shared, and that they do need the information that you have to really build the case for this policy, that they're not experts. So we spent a lot of time just talking with legislators as the session was getting started. We just made sure to spend a lot of time with legislators on both sides of the aisle, educating them about the current state of food insecurity among children in Maine in their specific district. We worked with school nutrition directors in a lot of the districts, legislative districts, where there were, legislative leads. So, the Senate Majority Leader and Minority Leader, and all of the various leads across the legislature and within key committees who would be making decisions about this bill. We made sure to provide a lot of outreach materials for school nutrition directors, particularly because they did have these great on-the-ground stories to share, but also for everyone in our coalition, people that we were hoping to testify. We gave them talking points, template emails, helped them with a guide on how to participate in the legislative process virtually. Everything was over Zoom last year and still is. But we really were striving to gain bipartisan support. It sounds like Vermont was doing the same. We're a purple state in Maine. We currently have a Democratic majority. So technically we don't need any Republican support. We didn't need their support to get this bill passed, but we wanted their support. We knew that this was an issue that spoke to people on both sides of the aisle. And we're so glad that we did spend as much time as we could, getting strong support from both sides. And we were able to find a champion in the Senate Republican leadership. He drafted an op-ed, he testified, he had multiple conversations with his Republican colleagues to really bring lots of bipartisan support. And the bill ended up passing with bipartisan support in the Senate. It was unanimous. The House, I think there were like 20 legislators that voted against it. And, the rest of the 115 folks voted in support. So we really were able to secure that bipartisan support. And so much of it was that so many legislators, whether they were Democrat, Republican, Independent, they could remember what it was like to be a kid in the school cafeteria. So whether they were a kid who relied on school meals, or they had friends who relied on school meals, or they just remembered the whole experience, it resonated with them. And they have kids now, or they were a teacher, or their parents were teachers. It just spoke to them. And so this issue truly is universal. And it just helps to have support from as many people as you can get support from.
Yeah, and in these hyper partisan times, I never tire of hearing, Anna, about how you were able to secure bipartisan support for this in Maine, and it's just a really nice story to hear. So thank you for that. All right, we have just a couple minutes left. So if you have a question, why don't you type it in the Q&A box and we will try to cover it. And you can type those in here while I cover the last few slides. So Nomi, next. All right, so I just wanted to kind of put a bow on where everything is that Anna and Faye have talked about over the last hour, and that is that Maine successfully passed legislation, and that in Vermont they have an incredibly strong coalition and campaign that is ongoing, and it'll be fun to see in a year from now if we do another webinar like this, the other states that have passed legislation. Next. In terms of support that FRAC can provide for states that want to start healthy school meals for all, we want to let you know that we're here to help you write legislation. We can provide talking points and materials. We can share resources and lessons learned that we've seen across states, and we can help connect you to a group of states that stay coordinated as they work on their Healthy School Meals for All campaigns, and we'd like to be in touch with anyone interested in working on this topic. Next slide. So in summary of everything that we've covered today, I think here are some of the top line messages. There are many, many benefits to providing free school meals to all students. There's momentum for this issue in a way that there hasn't been before, and it's building across the country. 2 states, Maine and California, have successfully passed school meals for all legislations, and many more states have campaigns. And there are resources available to your state if you're interested in starting in on this issue. So with that, I will just do a quick check of the Q&A box to see if we have any questions, but I don't believe that we do. And I hope that's because this has been thorough and that we've answered some along the way. So I want to again thank Faye and Anna, and we'll send out a follow-up email with links to the resources and materials that we have referenced throughout this presentation. Thank you so much, everyone.